The clock on the wall read 10:47 p.m. when Thomas Reed pushed his cleaning cart through the back entrance of the Riverside Symphony Hall. The wheels squeaked softly against the polished marble floor, a sound he'd grown so used to that he barely heard it anymore. 12 years. That's how long he'd been coming through these doors 5 nights a week, cleaning up after people who never really looked at him. Thomas didn't mind being invisible. Not really. There was something peaceful about it, actually. While the musicians packed up their instruments and chatted about their weekend plans, he would move quietly between the rows of velvet seats, picking up forgotten sheet music and water bottles. They talked right over him, through him like he was just another piece of furniture in the hall. Tonight was like any other Tuesday. The orchestra had just finished their evening rehearsal, and the building was slowly emptying out. Thomas waited in the side room, sitting on an overturned bucket eating his sandwich. He always waited until most of them left. It was easier that way. Less people to navigate around, less conversations to overhear that reminded him of a life he once wanted. Through the small window in the door, he watched the last few musicians file out. The principal cellist was complaining about her parking ticket. 2 violin players were making dinner plans. The conductor, Maestro Richard Pembroke, was talking loudly on his phone about some charity gala. None of them glanced toward the maintenance room where Thomas sat. When the heavy front doors finally closed and the lock clicked into place, Thomas stood up. He grabbed his cart and made his way to the main auditorium. The stage lights were still on, casting a warm glow across the empty space. This was his favorite part of the night. When the hall belonged only to him, he started with the stage like always, carefully sweeping around the conductor's podium, wiping down the music stands, making sure every chair was perfectly aligned. Thomas moved with practiced efficiency, but his eyes kept drifting to that podium, that small raised platform where Maestro Pembroke had stood just an hour ago, commanding an entire orchestra with nothing but hand movements and passion. Thomas had watched him tonight, same as every night. Watched how Pembroke's left hand shaped the sound while his right hand kept the rhythm. Watched how he leaned forward during the quiet parts and stood tall during the crescendos. Thomas had memorized every gesture, every cue, every subtle signal the conductor gave to his musicians. By 11:30, the stage was spotless. The audience seating area was next. Row by row, Thomas worked his way from the back to the front, his hands moving automatically while his mind wandered. He thought about the piece they'd been rehearsing tonight. Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. Beautiful, powerful, emotional. He knew every note of it now, after hearing it practiced dozens of times over the past month. An hour later, Thomas found himself back on the stage. His cleaning was done. The hall was silent except for the gentle hum of the heating system. He should have been heading home. His small apartment was waiting, and he had to be back here in less than 10 hours to start his morning shift. But instead, Thomas set down his mop. He walked slowly to the conductor's podium. His hand reached out and touched the smooth wooden surface. He'd cleaned this podium 1,000 times, but he'd never stood behind it. Not really. Not like this. Thomas looked out at the empty seats. 2,000 of them, all vacant, all waiting. In his mind, he could hear the rustle of programs, the quiet coughs, the anticipation before the music begins. He closed his eyes and lifted his hands. The orchestra wasn't there, but Thomas could hear them anyway. Violins, violoncellos, double basses, woodwinds and brass and percussion. He'd listened to them so many times that their sounds lived in his memory, clear as crystal. His hands began to move, tracing the patterns he'd watched Maestro Pembroke make. His right hand kept time while his left hand shaped the phrases. This wasn't the first time Thomas had done this. Almost every night after finishing his work, he would stand here and conduct these phantom musicians. Sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for half an hour. He would work through entire symphonies, giving cues to imaginary players, feeling the music swell and fade around him. No one knew about this secret ritual. No one knew that before Thomas became a janitor at the Symphony Hall, he'd been a music student at the State University. No one knew that he'd spent 3 years studying music theory and composition before everything fell apart. The fire had happened on a Wednesday morning. Thomas was 20 years old in his junior year, practicing in one of the university's rehearsal rooms. He got the call around 10 a.m. The apartment building where his family lived had gone up in flames. His mother, his father, and his younger sister had made it out safely, but everything they owned was gone. Everything. Thomas left school that afternoon and never went back. His father had been injured in the fire, unable to work. Medical bills piled up. His sister needed clothes, books, a place to live. His mother was trying to hold everyone together while working double shifts at the diner. There was no money for tuition, no money for anything except survival, so Thomas found a job. The symphony hall was hiring maintenance staff and he needed work immediately. He told himself it would be temporary, just until things stabilized, just until he could save enough to go back to school. That was 12 years ago. The temporary job became permanent. The emergency became his life. His family was okay now. His father had recovered. His sister had graduated college and moved to another state. His mother had retired. But somehow Thomas was still here, still pushing a cleaning cart through the same halls, still invisible, standing on the podium now, conducting music only he could hear. Thomas felt something stir in his chest, something that had been sleeping for a long time. It was a mixture of sadness and longing and anger and hope all twisted together. He'd given up his dreams to take care of his family, and he'd never regretted that choice. But some nights, like tonight, the weight of what he'd sacrificed felt almost too heavy to bear. His hands moved faster now, more urgently. The imaginary orchestra responded to his every gesture. In his mind, the music was building toward the finale, all the instruments coming together in one powerful, unified sound. Thomas's whole body was engaged now, swaying with the rhythm, his face showing every emotion the music demanded. He didn't hear the door open at the back of the auditorium. He didn't see the figure step inside and stop watching him. Thomas was lost in his own world, conducting his invisible orchestra, pouring 12 years of silence and longing and hidden passion into movements that no one was supposed to see. The music in his head reached its final chord. Thomas held his hands up for one last moment, then slowly lowered them. He opened his eyes and looked out at the empty hall. The seats stared back at him, silent witnesses to his secret. Thomas took a deep breath and stepped down from the podium. He picked up his mop and cart, ready to head home. Tomorrow night he would come back and do it all again. Clean the floors, polish the seats, and stand on this stage when everyone else was gone, conducting music that existed only in his memory. It was enough. It had to be enough, because this was all he had. The sound of slow clapping echoed through the empty auditorium. Thomas froze. His hands, which had been gracefully guiding invisible musicians just seconds ago, dropped to his sides. His heart started pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He spun around, nearly knocking over his cleaning cart. There, standing in the center aisle about halfway to the stage, was Maestro Richard Pembroke. The conductor's arms were crossed, and even from this distance, Thomas could see the smirk on his face. The kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Well, well, well," Pembroke said, his voice carrying easily through the space designed for perfect acoustics. "What do we have here?" Thomas felt his face burning. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to find something to say, some way to explain what Pembroke had just witnessed. But what could he possibly say? Pembroke started walking down the aisle toward the stage, taking his time. Each footstep seemed to echo louder than the last. "I forgot my score," he said, holding up a leather folder. "Left it in the conductor's room. Imagine my surprise when I came back and heard. Well, I wasn't quite sure what I was hearing at first." Thomas finally found his voice. "I'm sorry, Maestro. I was just finishing up the cleaning and "You were conducting," Pembroke interrupted, climbing the steps to the stage. He was still smiling, that awful smile. "Our janitor was conducting. Tchaikovsky's Fifth, if I'm not mistaken." "How? Charming." The way he said that last word made Thomas feel about 2 inches tall. He reached for his cleaning cart, wanting nothing more than to disappear. "I'll just finish up and get out of your way, sir." "No, no, please," Pembroke said, gesturing broadly. "Don't let me interrupt your performance. You seemed quite into it, very passionate, very enthusiastic." Thomas could hear the mockery dripping from every word. He grabbed the handle of his cart, but Pembroke stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Tell me something," the conductor said, tilting his head. "How long have you been doing this? Playing pretend up here on my stage?" "I wasn't," Thomas started. But Pembroke cut him off again. "Do you know what I do?" Pembroke asked. "I spent 8 years at Juilliard. I studied under Leonard Bergman in Vienna. I've conducted in 32 countries. I've won 4 international competitions. And you clean toilets and push a mop around." Each word felt like a slap. Thomas stared at the floor, his hands gripping the cart so tight his knuckles turned white. "It's really quite funny when you think about it," Pembroke continued. He pulled out his phone. "Gerald? Jerry, are you still in the building? Good, good. Can you come back to the main hall for a minute? And if you see Danny or Carol, bring them too. Trust me, you'll want to see this." Thomas's stomach dropped. "Please don't what?" Pembroke asked, his eyebrows raised in mock innocence. "Don't share this delightful discovery with my musicians? But they'll love it. We could all use a good laugh." 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. Thomas stood there on the stage wanting to run but somehow unable to move. His legs felt like they were made of concrete. Pembroke leaned against the podium, scrolling through his phone, occasionally chuckling to himself. The auditorium doors opened and 3 people walked in. Thomas recognized them immediately. Gerald was the principal violinist, a stern-looking man in his 50s. Danny played trumpet and was always cracking jokes during breaks. Carol was the first-chair flutist, known for her sharp tongue and sharper opinions. "What's going on, Richard?" Gerald called out as they approached. "I was halfway to my car." Pembroke's grin widened. "Oh, you're going to love this. Tell them what you were doing, Thomas." Thomas felt all 4 pairs of eyes on him. His throat was so tight he could barely breathe. "I was just cleaning," he mumbled. "He's being modest," Pembroke said. "Thomas here was conducting. Full performance, arms waving, body swaying, the whole show. Our janitor thinks he's a maestro." There was a moment of silence, and then Danny started laughing. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh you hear at someone's expense, not with them. "You're kidding," Carol said, but she was smiling too. "Really?" "I swear on my life," Pembroke said, raising his hand. "I walked in and there he was, conducting like he was in front of the Berlin Philharmonic. It was quite the sight." Gerald shook his head, a mixture of amusement and disbelief on his face. "Did you take a video? This is gold." "Unfortunately, no," Pembroke said. "But maybe Thomas will give us an encore performance." "What do you say, Thomas? Show them your moves." "Please," Thomas said quietly. "I need to finish my work." "Your work?" Pembroke laughed. "Your work is mopping floors, not this." He gestured dramatically at the stage. "This requires talent, education, years of training. You can't just stand up here and wave your arms around and call yourself a conductor." "I never said I was a conductor," Thomas managed to say. "But you were pretending to be one," Carol chimed in. "That's even sadder, honestly." Danny walked closer to the stage, still grinning. "Can he even read music? Do janitors learn that in janitor school?" They all laughed at that. Even Gerald cracked a smile. Thomas felt something break inside him. Years of watching, learning, practicing in secret, all reduced to a joke. Something they could laugh about over drinks later. The janitor who thought he was special. "Look," Pembroke said, his tone shifting to something that might have been mistaken for sympathy if you didn't look at his eyes. "I'm sure you enjoy music, that's great. But there's a difference between enjoying something and actually being qualified to do it. You're a janitor, Thomas. That's not an insult. It's just a fact. You clean. We make music. Everyone has their place." "Know your place," Carol added, nodding. "Good advice for everyone, really." Thomas looked at each of them. These people he'd been around for 12 years. These people whose conversations he'd overheard, whose messes he'd cleaned up, whose world he'd watched from the shadows. Not one of them was looking at him like a human being. He was a curiosity, entertainment, something to laugh about. "Can I go now?" Thomas asked. Pembroke stepped aside with an exaggerated bow. "By all means. Don't let us keep you from your important work." More laughter followed Thomas as he pushed his cart toward the side exit. His face was burning. His eyes were stinging. He refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. "Hey, Thomas," Danny called out just as he reached the door. Thomas stopped but didn't turn around. "Maybe stick to the mop from now on, yeah? Leave the music to the professionals." Their laughter echoed behind him as Thomas pushed through the door and into the back hallway. He kept walking, past the maintenance room, past the storage closets, until he found himself in the small bathroom at the end of the corridor. He locked the door and finally let himself breathe. The face staring back at him from the mirror looked tired, defeated. 12 years of invisible work, 12 years of silent passion. And in 5 minutes, it had all been turned into a joke. Thomas splashed cold water on his face. His hands were shaking. He could still hear Pembroke's voice in his head. "You're just a janitor." As if that was all he was. As if that was all he could ever be. But as Thomas dried his face with a paper towel, something else stirred beneath the humiliation. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. It took him a moment to recognize what it was. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold, determined kind. The kind that didn't shout or break things. The kind that made decisions and stuck to them. Thomas looked at himself in the mirror one more time. His jaw was set. His eyes were clear. Tomorrow, he decided, would be different. Tomorrow he would do something about this. He didn't know what yet, but he knew he was done being invisible. Done being the punchline of someone else's joke. He walked back to get his cart and finish his shift. But everything had changed. And somehow, Maestro Richard Pembroke had no idea what he'd just set in motion. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, replaying the humiliation over and over in his mind. Every laugh, every smirk, every word designed to put him in his place. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, the replay stopped. Thomas sat up in bed, his heart pounding with a decision he'd already made without fully realizing it. He was going to do something crazy, something that could cost him his job, something that would either prove them all wrong or make him look even more foolish. He was going to challenge Maestro Richard Pembroke. By the time the sun came up, Thomas had his plan. It was simple, direct, and absolutely terrifying. He got dressed, skipped breakfast because his stomach was too twisted to eat, and headed to the symphony hall 3 hours earlier than his usual shift. The morning rehearsal was already underway when Thomas arrived. He could hear the orchestra working through a Mozart piece as he walked down the corridor. His hands were sweating. His mouth was dry. Every instinct told him to turn around, to forget this insane idea, to just keep his head down and his mouth shut like he'd done for 12 years. But he kept walking. Thomas pushed open the door to the main auditorium. The music stopped immediately. 80 pairs of eyes turned to look at him. Maestro Pembroke lowered his baton, his expression shifting from concentration to confusion to annoyance in the span of 2 seconds. "Can I help you?" Pembroke asked, his tone making it clear that Thomas was interrupting something important. Thomas walked down the center aisle. Each step felt like walking through water. He could see Danny whispering something to the person next to him. Carol was already rolling her eyes. Gerald looked merely curious. "I need to speak with you, Maestro," Thomas said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. Pembroke glanced at his watch. "I'm in the middle of rehearsal. Whatever maintenance issue you need to report can wait until—" "It's not about maintenance," Thomas interrupted. Several musicians gasped quietly. "You didn't interrupt, Maestro Pembroke. It's about last night." The room got very quiet. Pembroke's jaw tightened. "I think we covered everything necessary last night. Now if you'll excuse us, I want to make you an offer," Thomas said louder this time. He'd reached the front of the auditorium now, standing just below the stage. "A challenge, actually." Pembroke let out a short laugh. "A challenge? You're challenging me?" "In a way," Thomas said. His heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone could probably hear it. "Give me 5 minutes with your orchestra. Let me conduct one piece, just one. If I can't do it properly, if I embarrass myself or waste everyone's time, I'll resign. I'll walk out of here today and never come back." The murmuring started immediately, musicians turning to each other, eyebrows raised, smiles forming. This was getting interesting. Pembroke stared at Thomas like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. "You're joking." "I'm not," Thomas said. 5 minutes. One piece. But if I can do it, if I can conduct well enough to prove I'm not just some janitor playing pretend, then you apologize. In front of everyone. You admit that you judged me unfairly. The murmuring got louder. Someone in the back actually laughed out loud. Pembroke's face had gone red. This is absurd. You can't just walk in here and demand. I'm not demanding anything, Thomas said. I'm offering a bet. You win, you get rid of me and you get to be right. I win, you learn that maybe you don't know everything about everyone. He paused. Unless you're afraid. That last part was a risk. Thomas knew it the moment the words left his mouth. You didn't challenge Maestro Richard Pembroke's ego. The conductor's face went from red to almost purple. Afraid? Pembroke said softly, dangerously. Afraid of what exactly? Watching you flail around and prove exactly what I said last night? That you're a janitor with delusions? Then accept, Thomas said simply. Prove me wrong. Should be easy for you. The room was electric now. Every musician was watching this exchange like it was better than any performance they'd ever given. Gerald was leaning forward in his chair. Danny had his phone out, probably texting someone about what was happening. Carol looked shocked and delighted at the same time. Pembroke was trapped and he knew it. If he refused, he'd look afraid of a janitor. If he accepted, he'd have to waste time on what he assumed would be a complete disaster. But with 80 witnesses watching, his pride left him only one choice. Fine, Pembroke said, his voice like ice. Tomorrow night, after regular rehearsal, 5 minutes. You'll conduct. He paused, thinking. A cruel smile spread across his face. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. First movement. Several musicians whistled or gasped. That was not an easy piece. It was one of the most famous, most challenging works in the classical repertoire. Pembroke had chosen it specifically to ensure Thomas's failure. Thomas felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face neutral. Beethoven's Fifth, first movement, tomorrow night. And when you fail, Pembroke added, you don't just resign. You admit in front of everyone that you were wrong, that you're just a janitor who had no business pretending to be anything else. Thomas nodded. And when I don't fail, you apologize properly. Not some half-hearted sorry, but a real apology for judging me based on my job instead of my ability. Pembroke extended his hand, and Thomas shook it. The conductor's grip was tight, almost painful. Tomorrow night, then. Don't be late. Though I suspect you'll want to run away before then. Thomas turned and walked back up the aisle. Behind him, the whispers exploded into full conversation. He could hear fragments as he walked. Did that really just happen? He's insane. Beethoven's Fifth? This is going to be a disaster. I'm definitely staying tomorrow to watch this. Thomas pushed through the door and into the hallway. His legs were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. And now he had less than 30 hours to prepare for the most important 5 minutes of his life. The rest of the day was surreal. Word spread through the symphony hall like wildfire. By lunchtime, every single person who worked in the building knew about the challenge. The story got more dramatic with each retelling. By mid-afternoon, Thomas heard someone say that he'd challenged Pembroke to a full concert. Someone else claimed it was for Pembroke's job. Thomas tried to focus on his work, but it was impossible. People kept staring at him. Some looked amused. Some looked pitying. A few looked curious, like they were seeing him for the first time. Around 4 o'clock, Helen from the box office stopped him in the hallway. She was a kind woman in her 60s who'd always been polite to Thomas. Is it true? She asked. About tomorrow night? Thomas nodded. Can you really conduct? She asked, not unkindly. I guess we'll find out, Thomas said. She studied his face for a moment, then smiled. I hope you surprise them. Lord knows Pembroke could use some humbling. That evening, as Thomas cleaned the auditorium after rehearsal, he noticed something different. The musicians were talking about him, not around him or through him like before, about him, and some of them didn't sound as certain about tomorrow's outcome as Pembroke was. I mean, he must know something, one violinist was saying. He wouldn't have challenged Pembroke otherwise. Or he's completely delusional, another replied. Either way, a third voice added, I'm bringing my camera tomorrow. This is going to be epic. Thomas finished his work and went home. He didn't stand on the podium tonight. He didn't conduct his invisible orchestra. Instead, he sat at his small kitchen table with a score of Beethoven's Fifth that he'd checked out from the library years ago. The pages were worn from study, marked with notes he'd made in pencil. He'd been preparing for this moment his entire life without knowing it. Every evening spent watching rehearsals. Every night spent practicing alone. Every sacrifice he'd made. It all came down to tomorrow. 5 minutes to prove he was more than what they saw. More than just a janitor. More than just someone to laugh at. Thomas studied the score until his eyes burned. Then he studied it some more. Tomorrow night, Maestro Richard Pembroke would get the shock of his life. At least that's what Thomas hoped. Because if he was wrong, if he failed, he wouldn't just lose his job. He'd lose the last piece of his dream that he'd been holding on to for 12 years. The thought terrified him. But not enough to make him back down tomorrow night. Beethoven's Fifth. 5 minutes to change everything. Thomas arrived at the Symphony Hall 2 hours before the evening rehearsal was scheduled to end. He'd barely eaten all day. His stomach felt like it was filled with rocks. He'd spent the previous night and all of today going over the score, remembering every detail of every rehearsal he'd watched, every recording he'd listened to in his apartment on his old CD player. He changed into his janitor's uniform like always. His hands shook as he buttoned up the shirt. For a moment he considered wearing something else, something nicer. But no, if he was going to do this, he'd do it as himself, as who he really was. The regular rehearsal was wrapping up when Thomas made his way to the auditorium. He could hear Pembroke giving notes to the orchestra, his voice sharp and critical as always. Thomas waited outside the doors, his heart pounding so hard he felt dizzy. When he finally entered, he realized the room was much more crowded than usual. Word had spread beyond the symphony. There were people in the audience seats. Staff members who normally left right at 5 were there. Helen from the box office, the lighting crew. Even some administrative people from upstairs. And in the back row, Thomas spotted at least 2 people with cameras who looked like they might be from local news stations. This wasn't just a bet anymore. It was an event. The orchestra members were buzzing with energy. Some looked excited. Others looked uncomfortable, like they weren't sure they wanted to be part of whatever was about to happen. Pembroke stood at the podium, arms crossed, that same cruel smile on his face from yesterday. "Ah, there he is," Pembroke announced as Thomas walked down the aisle. "Our brave janitor. I half expected you not to show up." "I'm here," Thomas said simply. His voice sounded calmer than he felt. "Indeed you are," Pembroke said. He stepped down from the podium with exaggerated courtesy. "Your stage awaits. 5 minutes, as agreed. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, first movement." He gestured to the orchestra. "They're all yours. Try not to waste too much of their time." A few people laughed nervously. Thomas walked up the steps to the stage and suddenly he was standing where he'd stood 1,000 times before. But everything was different. The lights were brighter. The orchestra wasn't invisible anymore. They were real people with real instruments, staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to outright disbelief. Thomas reached the podium. Someone had placed the score there, open to the first page of Beethoven's Fifth. His hand touched the smooth wood, just like he'd done countless times before. But his hand wasn't holding a mop this time. He picked up the baton. It felt light, delicate, powerful. Thomas looked out at the orchestra. 80 musicians, 80 chances to make a mistake. The violin section was to his left, violas and cellos in the center, double basses to the right. Behind them, woodwinds. Behind them, brass and percussion. He knew where every section sat. He'd watched them from the shadows for 12 years. "Whenever you're ready," Pembroke called from the front row of the audience where he'd taken a seat. "We're all waiting." Thomas took a breath, then another. His hands were trembling and he knew everyone could see it. For a second, doubt crashed over him like a wave. What was he doing? These were professional musicians. Pembroke was right. He was just a janitor. He should put down the baton and walk away before he humiliated himself even more. But then Thomas looked at the score. Those familiar notes, that iconic opening. Da-da-da-dum, the most famous 4 notes in classical music. He'd heard this symphony performed dozens of times. He'd conducted it alone on this stage more times than he could count. He knew this piece. He knew it in his bones. Thomas raised the baton. The trembling stopped. His hand was steady now. He looked at the orchestra, made eye contact with the concertmaster, the first violinist. The man looked surprised but gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Thomas raised his left hand, positioned his right, and brought them both down. The opening struck like lightning, da-da-da-dum, perfect unison. The sound crashed through the hall and Thomas felt it in his chest. He gave the next cue, his hands showing the shape of the phrase. The orchestra responded. They were actually following him. His body moved with the music, not wildly or without control, but with purpose. Every gesture meant something. His right hand kept the tempo steady and clear. His left hand shaped the dynamics, showing when to swell, when to pull back. He cued the woodwinds for their entrance. They came in exactly on time. Something was happening. Thomas could feel it. The orchestra had expected to play poorly on purpose to help prove Pembroke's point. But the music was taking over. His conducting was too clear, too precise. They found themselves actually playing. Thomas brought up the brass section with a decisive gesture. The French horns added their voice to the texture. His hand showed them exactly how long to hold the notes, exactly how to phrase the line. He was hearing everything, adjusting constantly. When the second violins rushed slightly, his right hand steadied them. When the cellos needed more intensity, his left hand pulled it out of them. He'd learned all of this by watching, by studying, by living and breathing this music for 12 years while everyone assumed he was just cleaning. Every rehearsal he'd witnessed, every mistake Pembroke had corrected, every musical decision he'd observed, it all lived in Thomas's muscle memory now. The first movement of Beethoven's Fifth rushed toward its conclusion. The tempo increased. Thomas's hands moved faster, bigger, demanding more from the orchestra. They gave it to him. The music built and built, all the sections coming together in one unified, powerful sound. And then, the final cadence. Thomas held his hands up, frozen, as the last chord rang through the hall. Only when the sound had completely faded did he lower his arms. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Thomas stood there, breathing hard, baton still in his hand. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. But what did that silence mean? Was it shock? Disappointment? Pity? Then, from the violin section, the concertmaster started clapping. It was slow at first. Just him. But then the cellist next to him joined. Then another violinist. Within seconds, the entire orchestra was applauding. Not the polite golf clap that orchestras give at the end of rehearsals. Real applause, strong, genuine. Gerald, the principal violinist who'd laughed at Thomas 2 nights ago, was standing now, still clapping. Others stood too. Danny, the trumpet player, had a stunned look on his face. Carol, who'd told Thomas to know his place, was shaking her head in disbelief, but she was clapping too. The people in the audience were on their feet. Helen was wiping tears from her eyes. The lighting crew was cheering. The camera operators were definitely recording all of this. Thomas looked down at Maestro Pembroke. The conductor was still sitting, frozen in his seat. His face had gone pale. His mouth was slightly open. He looked like someone had just told him the sky was actually green and had proven it. The applause continued. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" from the back. Thomas felt his eyes getting wet. He blinked quickly, trying to hold it together. 12 years. 12 years of being invisible, and now everyone was seeing him. Really seeing him. The concertmaster approached Thomas, still clapping. He extended his hand. "That was exceptional," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Where did you train?" "State University," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. 12 years ago. I had to leave." "Well, you never really left music, did you?" the cellist said, joining them. "That was better than half the guest conductors we've had." More musicians gathered around the podium. They wanted to know how he'd learned, how long he'd been practicing, why he was working as a janitor if he could conduct like that. Thomas answered as best he could, but he kept glancing at Pembroke, who still hadn't moved from his seat. Finally, the conductor stood up. The room got quiet again as he walked toward the stage. Everyone watched, waiting to see what he would do. Thomas's brief moment of triumph suddenly felt fragile. Pembroke could still find a way to twist this, to diminish what had just happened. Pembroke climbed the steps slowly. He approached Thomas and for a long moment just looked at him. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time ever. That was... Pembroke started, then stopped. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. That was not what I expected. The room held its breath. Thomas met his eyes, waiting. This was the moment. The apology that was part of their deal. But would Pembroke actually go through with it? Or would he find some way to save face, to maintain his pride at Thomas's expense? The cameras were still recording. The orchestra was still watching. And Maestro Richard Pembroke, conductor of the Riverside Symphony for 15 years, looked like a man standing at a crossroads, trying to decide which path to take. Pembroke stood there in front of Thomas for what felt like forever. The entire auditorium was silent, waiting. You could have heard a pin drop on the stage. Finally, the conductor took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, without the usual arrogance that coated every word. "I judged you," Pembroke said. He wasn't speaking to just Thomas anymore. He turned slightly so everyone could hear him. "I judged you by your position, by your uniform, by what I assumed you were capable of." He paused, and Thomas could see how much this was costing him. That was wrong. That was completely wrong. Someone in the orchestra shifted in their seat. Pembroke continued, "I've spent my entire career believing that talent and education can only come from certain places, from the right schools, the right backgrounds, the right opportunities." He looked directly at Thomas now. "You just proved that I've been wrong about that. What you just did up here, that wasn't luck. That wasn't fake. That was real skill, real musicianship, real passion." Thomas felt his throat tighten. This was actually happening. "I mocked you," Pembroke said, and his voice cracked slightly. 2 nights ago, I humiliated you in front of my musicians. I called people over specifically to laugh at you. That was cruel. That was beneath what a conductor, what any human being should do." He extended his hand. "I'm sorry, Thomas. Truly sorry. Not because you beat me in some bet, but because you deserved respect all along and I didn't give it to you." The room erupted, not in laughter this time, but in applause. Real, genuine applause. Thomas shook Pembroke's hand, and the conductor pulled him into a brief hug. When they separated, Thomas could see that Pembroke's eyes were wet too. "Thank you," Thomas managed to say. Gerald stood up in the violin section. "I think I speak for many of us when I say we owe you an apology too." We laughed along. We didn't think twice about it. He looked embarrassed. "You deserved better from all of us." Others nodded. Danny raised his hand from the brass section. "I'm sorry too, man. That was really incredible, seriously." Even Carol stood up. "I was wrong," she said simply. "I'm sorry." Helen was making her way down from the audience seats toward the stage. "Thomas, dear, I think you need to see something." She held up her phone. "This has been streaming online. A lot of people are watching." Thomas's eyes went wide. "Streaming?" "One of the camera operators is from a local news station," she explained. "They started broadcasting live when you began conducting. It's already been shared thousands of times." The camera operator she was talking about gave a sheepish wave. "Sorry, I probably should have asked. But this was too good not to share. You're trending on social media." Thomas felt dizzy. Trending. Over the next hour, as Thomas stood there still trying to process everything, the situation grew bigger. Helen kept refreshing her phone, giving updates. 10,000 views, 50,000, 100,000. The video of the janitor conducting Beethoven was spreading across the internet like wildfire. Phone calls started coming in, first to the symphony's main office, then to Pembroke directly. A reporter wanted an interview, then another. A classical music blog wanted to write a story. Someone from the State University's music department called, asking if this was the same Thomas Reed who had studied there 12 years ago. By the time Thomas finally left the stage, still in his janitor's uniform, the view count had passed 300,000. The next morning, Thomas woke up to 17 missed calls and 42 text messages. He didn't even know he had 42 people with his number. Most were from colleagues at the symphony, but some were from numbers he didn't recognize. One voicemail stood out. It was from Patricia Drummond, the director of the Riverside Symphony's board. "Mr. Reed, please call me at your earliest convenience. We need to discuss your future with the organization." Thomas's stomach dropped. He called back within 10 minutes. "Thomas," Patricia said, and her voice was warm, not angry like he'd feared. "I've watched the video probably 20 times now. The board had an emergency meeting last night. We'd like to offer you a position." "A position?" Thomas repeated. "Assistant conductor. You'd work alongside Maestro Pembroke, help with rehearsals, conduct some of our smaller performances and educational concerts. The pay isn't huge, but it's a lot more than what you're making now. And we'd like to sponsor your education. There's a conducting program at the university that offers evening and weekend classes. We'll cover the tuition." Thomas sat down on his bed. His hands were shaking again, but this time for an entirely different reason. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Completely serious," Patricia said. "What you demonstrated last night was remarkable. Raw talent combined with years of self-directed learning. That's rare. We'd be foolish not to nurture that. So what do you say?" Thomas thought about his small apartment. His cleaning cart. 12 years of mopping floors and being invisible. 12 years of standing on an empty stage, conducting music only he could hear. "Yes," he said. "Yes, absolutely yes." The news spread through the symphony hall faster than the video had spread online. When Thomas arrived that afternoon, still technically employed as a janitor for one more day, people kept stopping him, congratulating him, asking for his autograph, which felt completely surreal. Pembroke found him in the hallway. "Walk with me," the conductor said. They went to the main auditorium, empty now in the afternoon light. Pembroke climbed onto the stage and Thomas followed. "I've been conducting for 30 years, Pembroke said, looking out at the empty seats. "I thought I knew everything about music, about talent, about what it takes to stand up here. But you taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." He turned to Thomas. "Never assume you know someone's whole story. Never assume that the person you see is all they are." "I don't think less of you for what happened," Thomas said. "You apologized. That took courage." "It took you calling me out," Pembroke corrected with a slight smile. "I needed the wake-up call. We all did." He gestured to the podium. "I'm looking forward to working with you. Really working with you. Learning from each other." 6 months later, Thomas stood backstage at the Riverside Symphony Hall adjusting his tie. He was wearing a proper suit now, not a janitor's uniform. Through the curtain, he could hear the audience filling the seats. 2,000 people, all there for the symphony's educational concert series. This was his first time conducting a full performance as assistant conductor. The program included Mozart, Brahms, and yes, Beethoven's Fifth. Pembroke had insisted on that last one. "It's your piece now," he'd said. "Own it." Thomas peeked through the curtain. His mother was in the third row, having driven 6 hours to be here. His sister had flown in from out of state. He'd gotten them the best seats in the house. Helen appeared at his elbow. 5 minutes. "You ready?" Was he ready? Thomas thought about the question. He thought about the fire that had derailed his life 12 years ago. The sacrifice he'd made for his family. The years of watching and learning from the shadows. The humiliation that had somehow transformed into opportunity. All of it had led to this moment. "Yeah," Thomas said, smiling. "I'm ready." He walked onto the stage to genuine applause. The orchestra smiled at him. These were his colleagues now, his friends. Gerald gave him an encouraging nod. Danny shot him a thumbs up. Even Carol was smiling. Thomas picked up the baton, the same one he'd used that night 6 months ago. He looked out at the audience. All those people who had come to hear music, to experience something beautiful. And he got to be the one to give that to them. He raised his hands. The auditorium fell silent. And then, with a confidence born from 12 years of patient preparation, Thomas began to conduct. The music filled the hall, and Thomas realized something profound. He'd spent so long thinking he'd lost his dream. But dreams don't die. They just wait. Sometimes in the quiet moments, in the spaces between what we do and what we wish we could do, they wait for the right moment, the right opportunity, the courage to reach for them again. Thomas had reached. And the dream had reached back. The janitor who everyone overlooked had become the conductor they'd never forget. Not because his story was impossible, but because it was real. Because talent doesn't care about job titles. Because passion doesn't require permission. Because sometimes the person cleaning the stage deserves to stand on it. And now he did.